Okay, so remember when we said we were going to move into doing more controller specs and refactoring, that we actually were, when we said it should render a template and make the view results available to it, that was actually two different specs. So that was the first one. What about the second one? That it should make the search results available to this new template. Well, okay, sorry, one more Rails-specific RSpec thing you have to learn, but there's not that many more of them. Remember we said that when you set up instance variables in the controller, those instance variables are available for the view if it wants to use them. And conveniently, there's a Rails RSpec extension called assigns, which if you pass it a symbol naming a controller instance variable, it will return the value, if any, that the controller gave to that variable. And if the controller never gave anything value to that variable, then you just get back nil. So here's the second spec that says the TMDB search results should be made available to the template. Once again, we're doing this movie stub. We'll talk about this and return in just a moment. Post search TMDB, we've seen that before. And here's a call to this extension, right? I'm going to pass the symbol movies. And what that means is I'm looking for the controller to have set up an instance variable at movies. And I'm going to check that it assigned to that variable this fake results. Now, what's going on with fake results here? Unfortunately, because I can't find the right paste bin, these couple of lines up here, this before each, this is a setup that's going to happen before every single test is run. And what I really wanted to do was explain this separately, but that is now not going to happen. OK, well, no worries. We'll forge boldly ahead. So what's going on with our fake results here? Remember that our general strategy is we want to decouple the behavior of the thing we're testing from the other behaviors that it depends on. And before, when we were trying to decouple the controller from find in TMDB, all we did is we just said, OK, it should call find in TMDB, but we didn't really say anything about what find in TMDB would actually have returned. Now we actually have forced the issue a little bit because we're saying the controller is going to call this model method, find in TMDB, and whatever that method returns, we expect the controller to make that available to the view. So now we have to make the method return something, right? It's no longer enough to say the method should be called. We also have to pretend that it works and that it returns something sensible. So what are our choices here? Well, we could create an actual movie object, and we could say, which is what we've said, there we go, right here. We're adding, onto the end of this stub, we're saying not only stub the method, but make it return something. In this case, we're making it return fake results. So whereas before, all we were doing is overriding a method in place and waiting for it to be called, now we're also going to force the return value from it to be something of our own choosing. This is like a puppet whose behavior we can control. Now, the question is, what are we going to make it return? Well, here's what we're setting fake results to. It's a list of 2 movies. But no, it's actually not. It's a list of 2 things that almost quack like movies, but they aren't. Mock objects are stunt doubles. They're really stupid. They can only, sorry, no offense to actual stunt doubles out there in the 59,000 people watching this video. But the stunt doubles are not actors. They can't do all of the things that the role requires, but they could do a very specific thing at a specific point in time. And that's what these mocks are doing. They're going to stand in for movie objects. Now, in this case, what are we asking these movie objects to do? Well, nothing. All they have to do is look pretty and exist, right? All we're doing is we're going to pass something back from this stubbed method in the model and make sure that whatever it is we pass back, that thing is available to the view. We don't actually care if it's a real movie for the purposes of this test, right? This test isn't checking if find in TMDB does the right thing. It's just checking that whatever TMDB find does return eventually makes it back to the view. Everybody see what's going on there? This is kind of an extreme example of you're really only testing one thing at a time. So we've created 2 mocks, and we'll talk more about mocks in a moment. You can actually make them do a limited set of things, like sort of very slow puppets. But in this case, all they have to do is exist. We're going to stub this method and force it to return fake results. We're going to call our controller method, and we're expecting that if the controller method works right, it would assign at movies. And then we can check whether, in fact, the add movies variable got assigned and whether it got this value. Right? And by the way, if you take this to an extreme, this fake results doesn't even have to be an array of movies. In fact, it could be anything. It could be a string, right? It could be the string, I am a fake movie, because the only thing we care about is that whatever comes back from find in TMDB gets correctly passed to the view. This test doesn't care what it is. It just cares that it gets there according to the right path. OK, here's the simpler version. all inside a single test case. We set up fake results to be a couple of mocks. We stub, and we force it to return our fake results. We do our controller method post, and then we make sure that assigns movies gets the right thing. And when would this work correctly? There we go. So I'm not going to do the live demo, but you could tell that with this method the way it is right now, that spec would fail, right? What the spec needs to pass is for me to say this, right? Why is that? Because I'm looking for movies, the instance variable, right? And there it is, movies, the instance variable. I'm looking for it to contain whatever the result was that got passed back from find in TMDB. So everybody see how the moving parts work here? This is really extreme, okay? This is, we absolutely don't care if find in TMDB, we don't care what it does. All we care is that it has to get called, and whatever it returns has to eventually get to the view. That's the point of this spec and nothing else. All right. What a grand adventure life is. So that's kind of brings us to sort of the closing of another section here, and we have managed to introduce two new concepts. One of them was this method called stub. We already saw should receive. The difference between should receive and stub is that stub doesn't actually care if the thing gets called. Right? Remember that should receive not only sets up a sort of fake method, but also monitors if that method is getting called or not. Stub sets up a fake method, but it doesn't really care if it gets used or not. If it gets called, stub will be there to sort of pick up the pieces. And if we want, we can chain and return onto the end of it to control what the return value is going to be. And we also saw mock, which is a way to create a stunt double object. What we didn't do in this example, but is developed in some of the book examples, is we can make them be a little bit less dumb. For example, we could take a mock movie object, and we could stub the title method on movie so that if I called m.title on this, I would actually get back Rambo. But remember, it's not really a movie, right? It's just being told, hey, if somebody asks you for title, just say this line, right? It's very, very simple. And as a shortcut, you can actually pass a hash when you create the mock and say, oh, here's like 2 or 3 things the mock should do. Now, if you're sort of thinking 2 or 3 steps ahead of me, which is very likely given how sleep-deprived I am, you should realize that if you find yourself creating mocks with more than 1 or 2 of these stubbed out methods, you're like, wait a minute, why not just use a real movie and be done with it? And indeed, we'll get to that in just a moment. So those are our 2 new seam concepts. And kind of the overarching theme we're seeing over and over is that any type of seam is there to enable just enough functionality to get you through this particular test, right? You're testing one behavior, and it's like those Nautilus machines at the gym where, like, if you hook your arm just right, it, like, everything except like this muscle is isolated out. That's kind of, sorry, for those of you on TV, I pointed to a part of my anatomy. Everything else that is not the subject of the test, you isolate it by stubbing it out, by mocking it, whatever kind of seam, and Ruby makes this beautifully easy to do. So we can think of this now as we're kind of converging on a cookbook method here, right? Whenever we think about writing a new spec, we think about what is the one behavior that we want to test, where do we need to use seams so that we can isolate away all the other behaviors that are not the one we want to test, determine what's the thing we're actually checking, right? What is the expectation? Are we checking that something should be called? Are we checking that something should end up with a certain value? We write the test. Initially, it fails because we haven't written the code, so just make sure it fails for the right reason, as opposed to it fails because you made a syntax error. You add code so that the test passes green, and then before you go on, you look for opportunities to dry out or refactor or beautify your test. And there's some examples of that using before in Chapter 5 of the book. So what new techniques have we learned? So we'd already seen should receive. We'd seen with. We've seen and return. And by the way, with and return are optional, right? If we omit with, it doesn't matter what the parameters are. If we omit and return, we'll get back nil. And that's fine, right? Sometimes we don't care about the return value. We just want to make sure something gets called. Other times we care about the return value, and we want to force it to something that we can control. We learned about mocks, which is basically you just give it a random name, could be anything you want, and it doesn't know how to do anything out of the box, but you can stub individual methods on it. Should we had already seen. And we've learned one more specific extension to our spec for Rails testing, which is assigns. And it lets us check whether the controller correctly assigned an instance variable, and therefore the view would be able to have access to that variable. And the gray boxes, once again, this is the new stuff from this segment.